Okay, we're going to get started here with our workshop. Thank you all for coming. I don't know if I should whistle or just clap, but I would just like to say thank you for coming. We're going to be talking today about consuming culture, and let me just introduce our panelists. I'm McCracken. I work here at Biola. I'm also a film critic for Christianity Today, and I'm a writer, journalist. I like to think about culture through the lens of my faith. Jensen is also a writer, journalist, more TV, criticism for Entertainment Weekly. Some of you may have read his Lost recaps. He kind of became famous for being Doc Jensen during the Lost era, writing these amazing pieces of art in themselves, these recaps of Lost episodes. So I think it's interesting to have him for this discussion because that's an example of consuming culture well that actually becomes a creative act. It's almost like culture making, consumption as culture making. So we're glad to have Jeff here. And then Lisa Swain is a professor of film here at Biola, done a lot of thinking about just how we approach film and media from a Christian perspective and what all that means. So thank you guys for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So just to kind of frame the discussion when we're talking about consuming culture, I know that word consuming can be a loaded term, but the way I've approached it is just we're all consumers. By virtue of being humans, we consume things. To live, we need food and water. So it's just a word that we're using to get at being on the receiving end of culture. So there's the making end of culture. We were talking earlier about Andy Crouch's book, Culture Making, which is a wonderful book that we would recommend. But I know in my book, Gray Matters, I was looking at the other end of receiving culture. How do we do that well? And I think in this day and age, for Christians especially, we often want to rush fast to the making side of it. We have kind of this evangelical passion to want to go change Hollywood and make the next Passion of the Christ. But we often skip over the whole being a good consumer of culture and learning what are the great films out there and doing the years of research and learning how to receive culture well. So I think that's what I've kind of would like to talk about here. What is the relationship between being a good culture maker and being a good consumer of culture? How do they interact? And then what does that look like just in practice? How do we live that out in our day-to-day lives? So maybe we'll just kind of talk about that for a while, but then I'd love to just open it up to the group here, just have Q&A if you have questions about this or anything else really. We'd love to just make it an informal time of interactivity on this topic. Sound good? Okay, so I guess the first question to get us going, three of us, is just what is it about cultural consumption? Why should it matter? Why should Christians care about consuming culture well? Anyone want to start?
Well, the main reason is about listening. We've talked about this before. I take umbrage with consumption. This simply because it's a very American approach to look at this, and you even talked about this earlier, looking at culture as this thing that I consume. When media, by its definition, is communication with something in between. So it's communication, and in its rawest form, it's human expression. It is people telling me about what they think about the world. They're telling me about their dreams, their solutions, their disappointments, their way of parsing the world. And a lot of times when we look at media and we use the verb consume, we're doing that very American thing of separating the production from the reception. And what gets lost is we end up using rules for consumption. Is it good for me? Is it bad for me? Instead of looking at it relationally, instead of looking at it this is my chance to find out about the world. It's my chance to see what is important and to learn. Mm-hmm. So you actually made a comment earlier today that I tweeted. I tweeted a lot of what you said, but it was the idea of it's almost reckless to not engage media if you want to love people, because that's where you find out about them.
Right. Yeah. My response to this question begins with we should care about consuming culture because I care about people.
Yeah.
At least I want to care about people. Sometimes I really can't stand people, but I want to, and I want to know how to love them, how to speak to them, and part of that is knowing like what's relevant to them. What are the stories that they're filling in their heads? What kind of cultural content that are that do they have a relationship with? If I want to be a successful parent to my child, I have to know that. So I need to know what my son, what my daughter, what they're putting in their head, and what they get out of it, so that I can talk to them, not necessarily judge them, but talk to them and relate to them, and what's appropriate then for my kids should be appropriate for everyone. I think the other reason why we need to care about culture and study it and immerse ourselves in it and understand it is that so much of our culture today like wants something from us, you know. Yes, it's not something that we come to anymore. Culture is like practically attacking us, you know, like if you're on Facebook and you're on your news feed, you are being bombarded with lots of messages and lots of content from your friends, from people you think are your friends or your enemies, that like want to impact you with something like this. And so, yeah, you could choose to ignore that, but I think that I want to know how to understand that. Yeah, I feel a responsibility to, while I'm here, I'm just not writing out this life until the end times, right. You know, like I feel like while we're here, we have a job to redeem our culture. Yeah, so I got to know, I have to understand how it works. Right. And because we want to be great culture makers, I want to be really good at culture making, formally and in content. So I want to look to the best guys and the worst and learn from them.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned like social media and just the constant stream of culture that's coming our way. As I've thought about the importance of being good consumers of culture as Christians, like social media has really changed the way that like our cultural consumptive habits are like more public than ever. Like we live our lives in public through like tweeting our thoughts about a movie or like posting a Facebook post about last night's episode of Walking Dead. So the way we engage culture is on view for the world to see. So in my view, that means it's more important than ever that we're being careful and just thoughtful in the way that we engage culture, because what kind of message does it send if we're a Christian and on Facebook we're like slamming some movie or some piece of culture in just like a reactionary way? Like that's just reinforcing what maybe our Facebook friends already think about Christians.
Mm-hmm. It's a form of bullying.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
It's slamming.
Right.
Is that, you know, the if the person who had created it was right in front of me, I would be much more cautious about some of the things that I say. But because there's that distance, it, you know, so there's a sense of which is bullying. What were you going to say?
No, I relate to that too. Yeah, I mean, like something about social media or our digital era. Really, you know, there is this whole other reality now that we live in, right? You know, and like as soon as this workshop is over, I'm going to be on my phone and I'm going to become my digital citizen Jeff self, and I'm going to be on Twitter. Right. I'm going to be on social media, and yeah, so we just have to be aware of the rules of that world and how that world really works.
And I think something we were talking about at lunch, like when you have a platform, which, you know, you do, like there's almost like this sense of like you're modeling healthy cultural engagement for people, and people learn. I think there's some statistic about like people learn 98% through just imitation and following examples of how people model behavior. And so that's another way that like social media and the digital revolution has changed the game for how we even perpetuate cultures of like approaching these things. Like when we have great examples to look at, like you in the way that you write about TV or whoever else, there's power in that. Yeah, I mean that's it's what I try to do. Like I try to do that. I'm very conscious of the fact that like we need to change the way Christians approach film, and we need to like change the market demand for less fireproofs and more like nuanced, complex art. And the only way to do that is to to model like interesting, compelling engagement with a different sort of film.
And you model something that's actually, which I really value, and is very necessary, and in some ways represents a really dramatic shift in my lifetime, which is, what's the new Cronenberg movie called again? I'm sorry.
Maps to the Stars.
Maps to the Stars. So Brad just recently wrote a review of Maps to the Stars by David Cronenberg. And, you know, Cronenberg's a tough filmmaker. And what I loved about your review is, you know, like 20 years ago, a Christian film critic just dismisses this movie.
Well, Christianity Today wouldn't have reviewed
or not at all, right? You gave that movie a fair shake. You used your imagination and intellect to enter into that movie, appreciate it for, well, its artistry, but also for content which, I mean, this is not a Christian film, but it describes some things, and describes some truths that we recognize as truth.
Right.
And then you also entered into it without sort of any judgmental stance or punitive stance, and said, but here's how this film doesn't necessarily represent a full view of a Christian worldview, whatever. And you called that out without much judgment, but I just really appreciated that. Like, we need more of that.
Yeah, non-punitive, just engagement is something different than just like shutting off the conversation by saying like the Noah movie adds things to the Bible, so therefore we can't appreciate any of it.
Yeah, I would add to that, and I do think that it's a progression from that, you know, in the 80s and 90s we were kind of obsessed with looking at things through the worldview, the whole Francis Schaeffer thing, which was helpful in that it got us away from the withdrawing from culture, but it was destructive in that it insisted on, you know, it kind of came at something with assuming that we had it all, we were measuring it against, like, does it fit this way, that way, instead of willing conversation as a looking at what's actually there.
Right, taking it on its own terms.
Taking it on its own terms, right. So it'd be like listening to someone in a conversation and saying, I've already decided what you're going to say, because I know where you're coming from, as opposed to listening to what someone actually has to say. Mm-hmm. And that goes back to why it's important for us, is that I think a lot of our stuff has missed the mark because we haven't been listening. And our stuff tries to answer questions in a way that aren't being asked.
Right.
Instead of, and the message has gotten in the way of, you know, being relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense. I'm not quite sure. It was a little circular, but.
Did you like the film Lars and the Real Girl? Real Girl?
Yes, yeah.
Have you guys seen Lars and the Real Girl?
How could you not?
I love that movie.
Yeah.
And I love that movie for many reasons, but one of it is that I just provides a beautiful allegory of Christians engaging culture if you choose to view Ryan Gosling's relationship to a blow-up doll as like a relationship with pop culture. And so here's this Christian community that are like, holy smokes, we have this kind of like odd member of our community who is obviously going through a rough time, and obviously has a relationship to things that are not, you know, like to culture. If you that's not necessarily healthy. How do we respond to that? And any other sort of model of Christian engagement I've seen, or that kind of model, would be judging and shaming and all of that. But I loved how they just tried to understand that and take it seriously and just kind of love them in that. And you know, like the narrative of that movie provides a happy ending for Lars, and maybe that doesn't happen all the time, but I was really inspired by what that Christian community modeled, and I thought that was a really great story to have out in the culture.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One question I would have is, how do we practically like get more Christians to learn to appreciate like the Lars and the Real Girl type films? Like, what do we do practically aside from, you know, you and me like doing what we can to like model it in our criticism? Like, is there anything our churches, institutions like Biola can do? Like, any ideas? Like, how do we mold healthier, more nuanced consumers of culture in the Christian community?
I think you do it by what you're saying, you know, just one critique at a time.
Yeah.
Slowly and having conversations like this. I mean, it lives in the debate.
Right.
maybe where we got in trouble initially in this conversation was trying to come at it from a top-down approach, as though we've got the answer, but it sort of lives in the discussion in the community now, and that's kind of where it should be.
Yeah, there is no answer to this question from a top-down approach. It's all relationships.
Yeah.
So it begins as a parent and having a whole new kind of like philosophy on culture, how you're raising your kids up in a pop culture. So I have to be active in my kid's life and sort of curating. I think curating is a word that I gravitate toward. Curating their cultural experience. I want to expose them to stuff. I want to teach them about stuff. I want to have conversations with that stuff. As Lauren would tell you, I'm not necessarily a great example of that, but I think that's an ideal to work toward. And I think that our churches need to do a better job of offering programs, engaging people in how to think about culture. It starts there. It's just going to be a generational renewal kind of like process of just like new generations becoming more sophisticated, more engaged, less fearful. Part of that includes a responsibility to yourself to know what's good for you, what's not good for you, to have a right relationship with culture and a right relationship with your own desires and your interests.
I think that's where community also can really benefit it, because when we go it alone, so as like lone wolf consumers, it can be really easy to consume things that are unhealthy for us, and we don't have we have blind spots for that maybe, but when you're doing it in community, others can keep you in check and be like, is that really the best thing we should consume? So,
but be careful about that too, in the sense of I think we have freedom as individuals, to have a difference of opinion on a piece of culture. Community then is good in making sure that you are having operating within boundaries and all of that. But most Christians that I know, when I tell them that I was a big fan of American Horror Story in its first 2 seasons, they go, "Should I be worried about you?" And I said yes. No, but then that begs a conversation about what I think is valuable about that show, what I think is not valuable about that show, and
I just was going to. I wanted to actually throw in a question here, because this discussion is discussed quite often at Biola in terms of what lines should be drawn, because which is one of the things you bring up in your book, which is really helpful. Is because we do have sort of this. We've moved away from this engagement with culture where everything is off limits to everything is within limits, and I wanted just to ask you guys, because you're both men. Stating the obvious, Captain Obvious here. But in terms of age, because you talked about curating for your daughter. So, and curating and being part of that curating process as professors for young men and women coming into, because I don't want to leave women out of this, and we often do get left out of the conversation when it comes to sexuality. It's always couched in a men's issue. But where, in your opinions, where does age fall into that, especially in the college, college age? What curating rules would you, as men, offer to young men? Because I've dealt with this question myself, but I will confess that as a female professor, there are times when I feel like I really long to have male professors speak to this, because I don't want to know what it's like hormonally to be dealing with. And there's a perspective of, in our, this is probably taking the conversation in a direction you didn't intend, but that's okay, I'm hijacking. But there's just there's a, in the Christian community, there's this dragon in men, sexuality awakening that we don't want to disturb, And so I'm just kind of wondering if you could speak to that. I'm sorry to
So,
interject, but
this is like
pertinent,
my,
isn't it?
my,
I mean, not
my
about consuming
suggested
media
my suggested cultural reading list for like 18 to 22-year-old men.
includes.
Oh, jeez.
Wow.
I'm just curious. Is that not something that you guys would want to know? I mean, I don't know. I should have warned you. I had no idea I was going to ask this.
Okay, so I'm going to offer an answer to your question. I don't think I'm answering your question, but what
Okay.
I find really interesting about culture right now, in terms of like gender and specifically men, is that we've lived at a time in television, for example, where a main project of a lot of television storytelling is the deconstruction of male archetypes. So we have a lot of television that tells us what kind of man not to be.
Not to be.
You know,
Yes.
like everything from Mad Men, which is kind of exploring kind of like mid-century, male mid-century notions of maleness that have stayed with us and fallen away, but stay with us. To even Breaking Bad and the male drive for significance and for work and all of that. Even True Detective, I thought, was a really interesting reflection on maleness. We need more stories about the reconstruction of maleness now, right? Like what does then to really, and we need some bold storytellers to step up and tell us that story. Conversely, I think we live in a really wonderful time of storytelling that is really, if you're open to it, well, it's been very kind of exposing of misogyny in our culture, and shockingly, like really reductive and retrograde views of women that men have, so a lot of the stories on television that are really from there's a huge movement toward this. It's no accident that in Tomorrowland, like we wanted a female protagonist. We just don't have enough female protagonists. Well, actually, we have a lot of them now, like from Hunger Games to Divergent. But we want to promote more of those kinds of stories and that kind of thing. And so, I don't have a list of shows for you. I'd love to develop one for you. So off the top of my head, I can't say I could provide a list for you now. But I think that's a fascinating topic. At the very least, to be culturally aware that this is actually a very kind of like huge subject matter in our culture right now, kind of like really testing, debunking, promoting, debunking old kinds of like gender archetypes and promoting new ones.
Yeah.
Was that at all helpful?
No, it was very helpful. It was very helpful. And I do you have anything to add about the whole?
Yeah, I mean, if I were teaching a class at Biola and I was like considering films to show, and I was considering a film that had explicit sex or nudity or whatever, I think it would be something I would want to like dialogue with the students about beforehand, like, because I wouldn't ever want to just come in like, okay guys, we're watching this, not knowing where everyone's coming from, because I do think that this is an issue, and I've talked about this in Gray Matters, where everyone's line is maybe slightly different of like what is a stumbling block and what isn't. And so I would just want to like be real honest with everyone and encourage a culture of like, it's okay if you don't feel like this is something we should watch as a class. Like, I don't want us to at all feel like prudes or like sheltered Christians because we don't think it's good to watch this. But I think it would be good to have that back and forth with those who think, no, we should watch this for these reasons, and because this director is like an auteur and this is art. And I think it's important to do it in community, which kind of is a theme that we keep coming back to, is like the importance of culture consumption as a communal activity.
Community, I agree. Community is so, because and again, it's that whole idea of consumption. When it's alone, it becomes narcissistic. So it's just about how it feeds me,
Right.
which is a lot more likely for a sexual image to become pornographic. Instead of realizing that within the context of the story, those images may be trying to say something altogether different from what it might do for you as an individual as a when it's pornographically consumed, narcissistically consumed.
Yeah, we definitely need better stories, better art, better conversation about in our culture about what it means for a man to be a sexual being, because we have a lot of stories that like criticize and critique and deconstruct that and tell us how we can be horrible sexual beings, and they're all true. But there's no transition into like better stuff. You know?
there are very few 500 Days of Summer that shows
Right.
you with with the guy with the heart.
Right.
There are very few
Right.
images like that out there.
Yeah.
Going back to the TV shows that maybe show healthy male characters, I would put forward Friday Night Lights as an example of that. Like, I think that show was so refreshing because, like, the lead male character, Kyle Chandler, was actually a good dad and a good husband, and it's crazy that's so rare. But you're right,
Yeah.
like, it's kind of a thing in TV now to play with. Yeah.
Walking Dead is like one of the.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see how they end that series if they redeem them.
Mhm.
'Cause Walking Dead is a series that's wrapping up.
Zombie.
Or if they
Sort
get
of
eaten.
deconstruct. Yeah, or that's the other option.
That's
I'm
what we're
voting
waiting
for
for.
eaten.
They turn out to be the
That's
zombies
dark.
all along.
They turn out to be the zombies all along. It was.
We are the Walking Dead. Come on now.
Bingo. Big reveal.
Little unknowns.
Yeah. Well, maybe at this point, like, if you guys have any questions, we could just open it up. Like, one thing I would like to hear from you guys is, like, are there examples of healthy Christian communities of cultural engagement that you've been a part of, like in your churches, here at Biola? Like, it'd be helpful for all of us to learn from other examples. Like, I know at Grace, your church, like, there was a small group about Lost that you led.
Yeah.
And, like, I had some friends who went to it and they just raved about it. Like, in some ways it energized them about church in ways that they hadn't been before. And I would put that forward as an example of how we can develop healthier cultures in our churches of cultural engagement. Are there other examples? Does anyone have? Yeah, David.
I have an example and I have a question.
Yeah.
My example would be Iris that I did here a few interterms ago
Mhm.
was the best cultural engagement I've ever had in an academic setting,
Mhm.
where we would have a subject for the afternoon, talk about that, and then watch a movie based off that subject, and then spend an hour and a half afterwards critiquing the movie based off what we just learned.
Right.
And I felt so energized in being able to do that. One of the ones I remember is Tree of Life, and it
Mhm.
totally changed my view of
Mhm.
filmmaking
Yeah.
based off that discussion.
That's cool.
The question I had was, as a film reviewer and as a Christian, both working for different publications, is there a line that is drawn, you're like, I should not be watching this, or this is not going to provide any cultural engagement for me whatsoever, that is not healthy? And is that different for working at Entertainment Weekly and working at Christianity Today? Because I know for me, I'm the film reviewer for this school's paper, and there's been several instances of pushback for reviewing a certain film because it's not healthy for our audience, and how I've had to fight that. I was wondering how you guys have dealt with that in your time as journalists.
And just to understand your situation better, is it just are they vetoing that because you like the movie, or they just think that from just a outside looking in, that's just not appropriate for our audience,
Shouldn't
whether
be
you like it or
watching it.
not?
Just not appropriate for our audience.
Yeah.
And it's been pushed back on several different occasions.
Yeah, that's one reason why I raised this question as I did, because drawing the line is a discussion that gets quite a bit of attention here.
Yeah. I mean, I think it definitely probably is different for our experiences at EW. Anything goes, probably, I would imagine,
Yeah.
in terms of what you review. Christianity Today, there's obviously some movies that we just wouldn't go there. Like, we wouldn't review, some NC-17 movie that probably, like, I don't know. We are pushing the boundary further than it's ever been pushed for Christianity Today. Like, Maps to the Stars, David Cronenberg's film, would not have been even touched by Christianity Today 10 years ago. And I think it's a healthy direction to, like, find those boundaries, knowing that people are seeing these films, and, like, we'd be, just our heads would be in the sand to just ignore the fact that, like, Christians are watching this stuff, so why not engage it and offer a healthy model of engaging it? But yeah, there are things that occasionally I, wonder, like, if I were assigned to review that, like, would I want to put myself through that? I don't know.
Yeah, it's the editorial mission of Entertainment Weekly to basically review everything, but we can review everything. I mean, we have a lot of resources. I mean, we have a lot of pages per week. We have a website, so whatever we can put in the magazine, we can put online. not everyone has that kind of resources. Not everyone has that kind of opportunity. I mean, I don't know how often do you publish daily here?
Weekly.
Weekly? And you probably have how many pages?
Really like 4 pages.
Right. So you have to call your shots. So like as a sort of culture keeper in that in that functionality, I think that you have a responsibility to say, hey, like, you got to tackle the important things. You got to tackle the things that you know are going to have huge impact. If there's some kind of, if there's some kind of obscure little film that like is going to have zero cultural impact, but you want to champion, but you're getting pushed back, and that's unfortunate. But at the same time, given your situation, yeah, I mean, I think that it would be wrong if you're getting pushed back. If there's a movie that is obviously going to have a big cultural profile and impact a lot of people, I think you have a responsibility to engage that piece of culture. And I hope that there can be new freedoms here where you can be able to do that. If it's going to be a film that, like, is definitely great to write about, but is not going to have that kind of impact, I think that you and your responsibility with your publication can say, this is just not something I'm able to talk about.
I'll just give David some props here. He wrote a review of 50 Shades of Grey for the Chimes
Oh, cool.
a few weeks ago, and it was a really great example, I think, of like tackling like a big cultural movie that everyone's talking about from a uniquely faith-oriented perspective. So that was good.
And I'm sure you got pushback on whether you should even be watching that or not.
That was a huge one, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to respond to that too, because I have decided to not watch that movie, 50 Shades of Grey. And the reason that I've chosen to not watch that is because I read most of the book. I didn't read the whole thing. But in reading the book and in hearing people talk about my perception of how the subject matter was being handled was that it was less than honest about the true repercussions of that kind of behavior. And the danger that we run into story, which has always been the fear, I think, of evangelicals in looking at story, is that we can lie, that we force a truth in a story that isn't a truth, and that we collude to an end that's not honest. And I don't ever want to champion that kind of storytelling. I think that it's dangerous. It's the same. It's the issue of women getting trapped in the idea that romance is the answer to all relationships. Men getting trapped in the idea that sexuality is our ideal relationship. It's that we have tropes that exist like that where those untruths exist, and so I don't want to champion dishonest storytelling, even though it exists all around me, and I can't. There's it's on a continuum, right? So I'm gonna have to engage in it on some level, but that's just. I think that there is a as a Christian, I do want to make sure that I'm supporting those things which are making an effort to get at it, and not trying to force a truth that I don't recognize.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's something that we need to remember is that good Hollywood filmmaking distorts the truth all over the place, and we need to call that out. It's not just because I think it's easy for us to look at poorly made Christian movies, and that's an easy target to say no, that's not reality. They're totally just sugarcoating reality. But I think secular movies in Hollywood also distort reality. And one of my critiques of Maps to the Stars was because I didn't recognize all that much truth in it because it was so exaggerated and so just taking the worst possible stereotypes of Hollywood and taking it to the extreme. And I know it's satire. I know that's what satire does. But I think to be savvy Christian consumers of culture, we need to call out the good, the true, and the beautiful wherever we find it, and call out the opposite wherever we see it as well.
Very much so.
Very nice, yeah.
Other questions about anything? Comments, questions? Yeah.
You had mentioned that there needs to be less fireproofs and more savvy, nuanced viewing on the part of Christians. But isn't there just a machine, an industry, like in the Christian fiction book industry, Brett?
Yeah.
Amish fiction, women's fiction, historical fiction. It's women's fiction. It's trite. It's puritanical type of stuff. And there's a whole machine to challenge them to say, hey, you shouldn't be reading that.
Yeah.
You should be reading this. Or in relation to the movie. What was the movie I just mentioned that you're talking about?
Fireproof?
Yeah, Fireproof. In
Yeah.
relation to Fireproof, it's equivalent to me coming up and saying, that's not that great. You shouldn't be watching that. You should be, or is it a both and? I understand, like you said, it has to happen at the grassroots of the church for sure, but in some ways, isn't the church perpetuating this watch Fireproof thing and not this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about Fireproof is those movies are huge successes because the churches are the ones packing out the theaters. Like, no one outside of Christianity is going to see those movies. It's speaking to the choir, and the choir is turning out in droves to see those movies, and that's where the problem lies. Like, and that's why I think approaching this problem from the consumer level and changing the market's desires over time, changing tastes, like.
But aren't you convinced? Don't you have to convince someone that Fireproof is inferior, or you watching it is not that great of a choice?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of come at it from a different point of view. I don't think it's about saying that Fireproof is inferior. It's not about, hey, Christians, you're dumb for liking this. It's about expanding what's possible. There's, I'm not that much of an elitist, like in the sense of like, there's a place for the Fireproofs of the world. There's a place for the Saving Christmases of the world. There is a place for the God is not deads of the world. I'm not asking for. I understand what you say. Like when we're saying we want fewer of those, because right now it just seems that that's all we have. But really, it isn't about swapping out some of those and putting in something better. It's about expanding what's possible. And that's the job that we have to do on the grassroots level, is encouraging, our peers, but maybe coaching the new generation to kind of like want more, want a broader array of things, and make it okay for them to want. Because that's the other thing too, which is that I think that there still exists within the Christian culture a fear of culture. A feeling like in order for me to enjoy a movie, it has to have this quality, this quality, this quality, this quality, and it has to call out the name of Jesus and all these kinds of things. And because of that fear and because of that, like we are limited in the kinds of films that we get. We have to expand. Yeah. And that's hard work, and that'll be a generational kind of thing. And let's be honest too. This isn't just we need our storytellers to tell us different kinds of movies, and it's just not, we got to want different kinds of movies. It also is going to have to take an act of faith on the primary decider of these things, is that people with money. These things cost a lot of money to make. They're businesses. It's this catch-22, right? Like a Hollywood studio might actually finance a Christian film. I don't know if I really like that term, but you know what I mean, of a certain kind of a genre, if they saw that there was an audience for it. But they're looking at us and they're saying, well, they only like certain kinds of films. They'll only support certain kinds of films, and we're either not interested in making that, or we don't know how to make that, or we don't have the marketing apparatus to market that. I mean, just to go on a little tangent it's easy to kind of really demonize Hollywood and say they don't make movies for us. They must be anti-Christian. The real problem in Hollywood right now is that our studios have been reorganized around these business models that are about huge event filmmaking. That's what drives their business. They don't know how to market smaller movies anymore. A really great example of this is, any Veronica Mars fans here? No? So are you guys aware of that Veronica Mars movie that was made through Kickstarter funds?
Yeah.
So, since the cancellation of that show several years ago, the filmmakers and the audience for that show wanted a film to kind of wrap up its storylines. And the studio was not averse to that, but what they said to them, quite honestly, was, we literally don't know how to make that movie anymore. Like, we don't make $5 to $10 million movies, and we don't have marketing divisions anymore that know how to market that movie. And so, and that's one reason why that movie ultimately had to go through the route that it did to get made. Similarly, I think that for a lot of Christian film that we're talking about low budget movies, and there's just not a lot of studio infrastructure. I think that I have a dim enough view of Hollywood to believe that there are a bunch of greedy people who would love to take our dollars, but they just don't really right now have the infrastructure and engineering to successfully do it, and so that needs to change. That means I think there is a business opportunity for Christian entrepreneurs to come along and say, I'm going to be a big player now in kind of growing and nurturing a vibrant Christian cinema. And they're going to put their money out there, and they're going to finance a variety of things. And I think, that's just going to happen. It will happen one day.
Although if the money chooses to make more fireproofs, I will be sad only insofar as it isn't so much. It actually goes back to what you said in your interview with Dane. The way in which these films galvanize the culture wars. It's like
right.
there's a when there's a movie that so toes the line that it becomes an emblem of this is what we want. And this is how you should be doing it, instead of realizing that all they've done is cater to us. So we're sort of living in denial that we're actually engaging culture when they're really just taking, they're just talking to us. It's the preacher talking to the choir. And I find that kind of, I don't want to, yay.
Right. But here's my Pollyanna Tomorrowland optimist for you here, right? Which is that what I like to believe is that if we can get more fireproofs, okay, maybe we live at a time where we get more of what we've been giving, what we've been given. Give us more. Keep on making more. Keep on making more of that. Hopefully, and hopefully those films will be seen. What's going to happen over time is that we will get tired of that. We will want more. We will ask for more. There will be that one film that sneaks in that will be different. We'll go, oh my gosh, and we gravitate toward that. That in turn will inspire more change. We have to make more movies. That's the first thing. And we have to also not be afraid to fail. We have to be not afraid to make really bad movies. And we just need to. But again, this is a business. This is a ministry. So it's easier said than done. I know.
Yeah.
But if we really want a vibrant Christian cinema, we need people to step up and make more movies. We need to support them, and then there needs to be a dialogue where we get more of what we really want.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah.
Like it.
Yeah, I think going back to kind of what you were saying, I too would not want to tell a Christian, make them guilty for liking Fireproof. That's not the right approach. But my approach has always been, expand the horizons to what else is out there. Because maybe they don't even know that there's other faith-oriented films that are better and are more nuanced and go under the radar. So, yeah, I mean, just from my own experience, growing up in a Baptist kind of, culture is here, faith is here type of environment where never the twain shall meet. When I saw Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line when I was a sophomore in high school, it was an awakening moment of my horizons broadened in terms of I experienced something spiritual watching that film, and suddenly my faith and my interest in movies intersected in a way I didn't have a category for before that.
Yeah.
So I want to give that experience to other people, to other Christians. there are ways you can encounter film that intersects with your faith, and it doesn't have to be inside the box of what we expect, you know. So, what other questions do you guys have for Jeff or for Lisa, or any of us?
I guess just you guys talking about everything and how Christian movies, how they've been, and some of them horrible, and I haven't seen, I guess, well, Passion of the Christ was pretty good. So I guess I'm just wondering, like, what would you want to see personally in a Christian movie, and should we call it that? Should we call it a Christian movie, or should we just take out that name and just display any like theological issues, or yeah, what would you want to see that's in a movie that, you know, has that stuff? Does that make sense? I don't know. Yeah. I just want to know your view.
Oh man.
I'd love to see a really vibrant, gritty, independent Christian cinema with films made by filmmakers making really personal films about their life and how faith gets worked out in their lives. Would love to see films that deal with some of the huge issues, which I think that are of a concern to the entire culture. And sometimes our cultural response to them separates us from the culture. For example, the problem of suffering. In my my walk of life, like I find that, you know, non-Christians who are not open to Christianity, or, you know, the big thing that they come to is the problem of evil and the problem of suffering. And they look at Christian examples that have nothing to offer them other than, you know, bright, happy, cheery people who know they're going to heaven, and so nothing really matters here, you know. What they want to see is, they want to see a little skin in the game. They want to see how that's actually working out in your lives. They want to see the anger, they want to see the pain, and they want to see how your faith comes along and helps them through that over time. I think that I want to see that done in a really formally beautiful way. And so I think that would be beautiful Christian art that would be valuable to the entire culture. That's what I would love to see. And I think, and I focus on that because I think that's possible. Like, I think that's easily attainable. I think it's going to happen. Like I was saying earlier, like we have a whole generation of kids who are Christians, who have now the ability to teach themselves rudimentary filmmaking language. And that's going to evolve, and they're going to grow. And yeah, some of them are going to grow up, and they're not going to become artists. They're not going to be filmmakers, but they're going to get to it. But some of them will, and they're going to say, "I want to make something that I haven't seen. I want to tell stories that no one else is making." And I think this is the low-hanging fruit of their first films that they can make. I'd love to really be able. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, I would add. I mean, I totally resonate with all of that. Like films that are honest about the problem of suffering and just unanswered questions. I think that's something that's been missing in a lot of expected evangelical cinema. Is everything's entirely wrapped up nicely by the end, and there's no questions left open. So that's not life. So right there, we could advance by being more open to telling stories that aren't perfectly resolved. And then the formal aspect of like beauty and artistry, I think, is like what I would like to see more of, honestly, is valuing beauty and like forward thinking. Like, what if Christians actually became the ones who are pushing the boundaries of aesthetics and film storytelling? That would be amazing. Because for so long we've been derivative, we've been like copycat. And that wasn't always the case in Christian art making, of course. Like, there was a time centuries ago where it was Christians who were the leaders. The church was the primary driving force behind the art world in Western history. What if that happened again? I mean, that's my dream.
Well, maybe if the church financed it in the way they did then.
Yeah, right.
You know, we don't.
Yeah.
It is no longer. It is no longer our.
Yeah.
It's no longer important to us financially.
Right.
So that could make a big difference.
And I think that aligns with what you said earlier about there's a business opportunity here of like, Hollywood doesn't know how to make these mid-budget films that appeal to the faith community. So what if we stepped in and like financed good Christian art in that kind of indie, personal filmmaking vein? That would be cool.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is to resist being a publicity agent for God. I think in Christian filmmaking sometimes there's a reluctance to be honest about relationship with God, and so there's this desire to sort of shave off the difficulties, and I just think God is bigger than that, and we're not really fooling anyone anyway.
Right.
But I would say that would be something I would hope for.
And more lightsabers. We need far more lightsabers in Christian movies.
Always a good thing.
Always a good thing.
I was wondering, you talked about how the studio world doesn't seem to know how to make these movies or how to market them. I'm wondering if the current world of cable TV might be a venue, because there's such a world now, limited series, 5-6 episodes, and that's it.
Right.
And I'm wondering if that's a possibility.
I think it's a really good possibility. I mean, it's just like we are in this sort of like gold rush, but I don't necessarily mean gold in the sense of like it's great. It's just a lot of it right now of just content, right? We have there's a business to be had in creating original content if you're a network or creating a new network. There's new networks, it seems, popping up all the time, or existing networks that are rebranding themselves so they can get into the original content game. And yeah, I mean, like, I think that there could be some real opportunities there. It's going to take like a great storyteller with a really good story that could come up to them and say, hey, like, there's a market for this. This is a story that can reach them, and maybe partner with some of these younger players. I mean, I think there's real opportunity there.
Interesting to see.
Yeah. I mean, Netflix, I mean, is just is quickly coming along and being a major distribution. I mean, if we should be having this conference 5 years from now, like, I mean, one of the major cultural conversations that's going to take place in general over the next several years is just like, what's a movie anymore?
Yeah.
And what is the difference between movies and television, and and everything is now content, right? And games, everything is just content. There was a deal that was announced this past week, and I think it could be a little bit of a game changer. I forget what the property is, but I think it's like a major filmmaker and is partnering with like Nicole Kidman on an adaptation of a very kind of famous book, and it's going to be a mini series on television. And it's just kind of like the quality of television and the decline of film. I mean, everything is sort of like evening out, and like and just just like television is just satisfying a desire that movies aren't giving us right now. So
Or maybe it's because, like you said, all they know how to make now are blockbusters.
right. So that mid-range movie is now your average cable television series. That's great for television. I'm not so much of a cinematic purist where I'm like, what a loss for cinema. Right. I mean, like, damn television, or have a dim view of television. I love the fact that television is getting better and is capable of expressions like Mad Men, Breaking Bad.
Character-driven pieces.
Yeah.
You just have time to develop these characters.
Yeah. I'd love to be able to go to a movie theater again and see like a really high, and we're still making that stuff. I mean, it's still out there. It's harder to find, but I just want better everywhere.
Yeah.
That's my interest.
Yeah.
The
You don't want
revelation
much.
to me was a few years ago when they totally remade Battlestar Galactica from the tacky 70s.
Hey, I like the 70s.
Well, I watched it too. But it
was much
a
better.
very strong witty program.
That was a great show.
Oh, yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's so often something we forget, but cinema is such a young art form in the grand scheme of things. Like, as we've known it, like purists might think like this is what a film is, but really like it's been in process since the get-go, and it's still in process, and who knows what it'll be. Television's even younger, of course.
Right,
Like,
right.
So, yeah, I think as Christians who want to make a difference in the media world, we need to be like innovating and thinking about what does storytelling look like in all sorts of different ways. Like, I'm very proud of Zach King, who's a Biola grad,
Yeah.
who like he's leading in innovation and storytelling on Vine, and that's what we need more of, is like more innovation. And what's the future of storytelling look like? Because we've been kind of a few steps behind in the last half century as Christians making culture. Like,
Yeah.
we get on the bandwagon of a certain forum, you know, the Christian Twitter comes out 5 years after Twitter, that sort of thing. So why don't we innovate? You know, why don't we be the ones on the cutting edge?
I love the example of Zach.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and there's a couple things that he's doing that just like I feel is kind of like really unusual from. I don't know if he self-identifies as a Christian filmmaker at all. I don't want to put that label on him, right? But I love that he's just making stuff
right.
over and over and over, and he's just putting a lot of stuff out there, and he's honing his craft, and he's honing his craft. That's exciting to watch,
Yep.
and it'll be interesting to see where he goes from there. And you know, he's having an impact,
Yeah.
a real impact. I mean, like my kids, especially my oldest son, love his videos. And then I tell him, know where he went to school? And he's like, really?
Yeah.
And like, and that changes the conversation for him. And you know, kind of go back to a little bit of a point you said about, I mean, I don't have a lot of belief that movies make Christians. You know, people are the
Right.
conduits for that, right? So it'd be interesting to see what Zach King inspires.
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely.
Yeah, you know, the thrill of just creating something.
Yeah.
You know, when you look at the waste of beauty there is in the world, I think as Christians we've somehow lost that just delight and just look at this,
Yeah.
you know, look at this and making this, and I think Zach captures that a lot. And in fact, it is very much like early film, because early film was much more like YouTube
Right.
than
Look what we
you
can
know, the
do now.
kinetoscope.
Right.
Right. He's like a little Méliès,
Yeah,
you know,
totally.
just making his
Absolutely.
own, making those first films.
He's the
and finding
Buster
out.
Keaton of Vine.
Yes. He needs to adopt that.
There we go.
There was a question back there. Yeah.
Yeah, the discussion is too much hinged on innovation and changing things. But my understanding of the arts is that they also are always reflecting on a tradition that already exists. So
Yeah.
that, you know, the little bit that I know in movies, I can often see references to other movies
Right.
or
Sure.
references to painting or something like that. Could you address that generally, but then also what would be the source material for Christians working? What would they turn to from the past rather than thinking we've got to invent the wheel? But what would be the good things that would give them something to feed on? And I guess I'd really like to, I mean, I'm not sure, but I thought I saw a little bit of that in the leader for Tomorrowland. Were you thinking of something when you wrote the narrative for Tomorrowland? Was there source material you had drawn on?
Well, Tomorrowland, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but Tomorrowland culturally seeks to sort of like very much exist in a space and have a conversation with lots of other kinds of films that are totally not like it. So a lot of dystopian narratives, a lot of apocalyptic narratives. I think like, you know, the world's going to blow up again 3 weeks before our movie in the Avengers 2. I think Mad Max, the reboot of that, comes out a couple weeks afterward. Our movie exists in an interesting cultural tension with those movies very intentionally. In terms of beautiful, cool movies that we were inspired by, that we allowed to influence our narrative thinking, you know, we kind of like, we really got a lot of inspiration out of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where that's a movie about a journey of discovery as opposed just to like a non-stop frenetic action film. And not that our movie is like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but I think that people might see that film, our film, and recognize that we kind of have that kind of thing, and we're definitely we definitely represent a pining for maybe that different for more of that kind of storytelling, something a little more patient. Not to say our movie is slow, but something a little more patient with itself and about a mystery and a discovery and all that. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I think that's a really important thing for the growth of Christians who want to be filmmakers. Is here this is where I will bag a little bit on the stuff that we've been given. I don't want to see them taking their cues from the quality of filmmaking that, let's say, Fireproof represents. I would love to see them take their cues and be inspired by Terrence Malick. Now, look, like Terrence Malick, I mean, everyone would love to make a movie like Terrence Malick, and everyone would love to see Hollywood support movies like Terrence Malick. But what he represents in terms of formal beauty and storytelling is really great. That comes to mind. I just agree with your point in general without kind of out of a loss for examples. But like I definitely think we need to turn younger filmmakers need to really investigate the past and make movies that are in relationship to the past. Yeah.
Could I follow up though? You mentioned Terrence Malick. How does he succeed in an environment that in general doesn't nurture, support, allow for the distribution? I mean, is there something in his story that should? I
have no clue. I don't know. He reminds me of Stanley Kubrick in the sense of like, he must have Polaroids of someone in his drawer or something. I don't know. No, in the sense of like, he's an unusual. This is why everyone wants to be Terrence Malick, is because he gets a lot of money to do whatever he wants to do in the most experimental fashion possible.
But I think it's because he's always been so cutting edge and pushing the medium forward that people give him money. They just want to see.
There are people out there who will support that, who want to be a patron to him.
Yeah,
the way that Warner Brothers was a patron to Stanley Kubrick ever since the 70s, and every 6 years he'd pop out with a movie.
And actors want to work with someone like that. So that's a big part of the equation.
Well, that's that too. That's right. I mean, Terrence Malick can make the movies that he wants to make because Christian Bale, Ben Affleck, Sean Penn, Brett, I mean, they could sell those movies. Yeah.
And another Terrence Malick point, just because I love Terrence Malick, but he is a good example, I think, of like, if you're going to be an innovator pushing forward the medium in which you're working, you have to be looking at the history of the medium. And he was a scholar of silent cinema and was a huge fan of that. And I think he's a case in point as to you can only innovate and know what it means to push forward an artistic medium if you've studied the history of it. And he's also just super steeped in classical music history and just all sorts of art, literature. And I think that's why I started this talk by saying, like, if we want to be great culture makers, we have to like do the work of studying the greats that have come before, because innovation won't happen apart from a familiarity and being steeped in the great art that has come before. Maybe we have time for one more question if anyone wants to get another question in. Yeah.
Maybe a perspective from Europe. We are visiting Margaret, my wife, and I for a month there as visiting scholars, and really appreciate it's a privilege to be part of this workshop as well. And thanks for everything you bring to our further reflection. That's very important. It seems to me that we have touched on a number of very important issues and stimulating issues relating both to how we as Christians should be really venturing into cultural creation, being salt and light, but also how to be responsible in our cultural consumption. Going back to that first issue, cultural consumption, You mentioned something about the need to develop cultural engagement in families and churches. It seems to me that we are very near one of the capitals of cultural making in Hollywood, and of course it has a global impact. So I think this is not just a question for one country like US or even Norway where we are based, but it's a global question. And it seems to me also that there is a lack of appropriate resources for churches and families to engage with a nuanced approach. Neither be condemning or shaming, as you said, or being totally just an open blank.
Yeah.
So I think this is actually a global issue, an issue that we need to network together across institutions, across different vocations, also because we live in the democratization of media kind of age, which we had so many important reminders of today. So could you reflect on that kind of challenge, the global issue also related to families, churches, globally, and also thinking about David Kinnaman and the Barna Group talking about "you lost me." What's the role of cultural consumption in that process? I think it's touched on, but it's also a process of discipleship making and also modeling salt and light in the world. So that was a lot packed in.
Yeah.
Some reflections.
I mean, I think it's, we just have to acknowledge that culture does shape us, and it's the ocean we live in, it's the air we breathe, and it shapes us, it shapes our desires, it shapes how we look at things, and Hollywood has a power to shape people throughout the world, and we've seen that, in the globalization and the way that pop culture from America and Hollywood changes. So just recognizing that there is power in that without kind of going back to kind of the media effects model of early Christian approaches, which basically said it's a smoking gun. It's like a bullet effect of like magic bullet theory. Like, so we have to like balance, like, yes, there's power in how culture shapes us, and we have to be savvy about that and be critically approaching the things we consume without fearing the bullet. So, I don't know if...
Yeah, I would like to say, I mean, I think inviting, the advantage of the globalization is that cultures outside of America get to hold up a mirror to us to say, this is what you're showing us, because you have a set of eyes that's not, so you can show us the assumptions that we're making that we're not even aware that we're making. So, the partnerships that you're suggesting between schools and, I think getting a dialogue started so that gets brought to light is, I think that's an exciting time to be alive when conversations like that can happen, because it does start to, expose whether it's imperialist tendencies or, capitalist or whatever the assumptions are that we're making that are, to us, they're just the nose on our face. But to you, they are, they're not necessarily accurate or even the best way to view the world. So yeah, I'm not quite sure where the question was, but I just want to go, yay. Yeah. Let's have those conversations, because they're really important, especially since we've been such a dominant force in the world culturally, and the amount that we still send out in the world without really thinking about the impact at all. We need to have those conversations.
Yeah, Hollywood definitely is thinking about the global appeal of their products. The global business is so much, a very much important part of what they do, which is why it selects toward really limited expressions of what they do, right? So like science fiction exports really, really well, superheroes export really, really well. That's a huge reason why Hollywood has just really doubled down on those huge movies. Our film is a benefit of that, So what that means is that globally we're exporting products that, I mean, that aren't really talking much about the human experience, let alone the American experience. I mean, it's just like it's all fantasy and stuff. You know, we've really been talking about this from a very parochial point of view, a very American perspective, right? I want to, you know, this sort of like filmmaking revolution that I'm hoping for, this storytelling revolution, is going to be global, and it's going to be in. We're going to hopefully see. I want to see just more vibrant Christian filmmaking in every single culture, in every single part of the world. I want to see other countries less dependent on crappy American products, and see like a really robust like cinematic scene and that level, both you know Christian, secular, yeah.
Great. Well, we have to wrap up, but let's thank Lisa and Jeff for being here.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.